One of the most damning things I've heard about education is that children come into school as question marks and leave as full stops. And to address that issue today, I'd like to share a prompt with you, which is designed to help us improve the questions we ask during our lesson planning, but also empower our learners to be able to ask better questions themselves. I don't know whether your experience of education is anything like mine, but I've noticed that when I'm teaching younger year groups, say 10, 11 or 12-year-olds, if I ask a question, I get a sea of hands in response. Everybody's keen to offer their opinion or to ask questions to clarify their understanding. And by the time we get to the late teens, they're very reticent to respond at all, and sometimes it's like tumbleweed and crickets. Even when a student does dare to offer a tentative response, it's usually framed with some sort of apology like, "This might not be true," or "This is probably wrong, but..." Or even worse, we get, "Is this going to be on the test, sir?" Now, I think this is in part a consequence of puberty and hormonal development, but it's also a reflection of the kind of educational system that we operate under, where so much of our focus is upon preparing young people for terminal assessments, for grades, and that leads to a kind of a convergent thinking and a domain knowledge focus, rather than the kind of divergent thinking and curiosity that we know is actually going to hold them in better stead in the real world. Well, I came across a prompt recently called the Cognitive Verifier pattern, which isn't a particularly sexy name, but what I think it offers is something really exciting. So let me share it with you now, and then I'll show you a couple of use cases where I've applied this in the last week in my own teaching and the really positive results that I've got from it. When you are asked a question about topic, follow these rules. Generate a number of additional questions that would help you more accurately answer the question. Show these questions in the chat. Then combine the answers to the individual questions to produce the final answer to the overall question. Ask me for my first question. Now, there's a lot of repetition in that prompt, and it's not particularly elegantly expressed, but as you'll see, it achieves some really interesting outcomes. So first of all, we can use this prompt ourselves in our lesson planning to ensure that we've got some well-crafted inquiries to deploy with our learners, which is more likely to result in a fluid and successful teaching experience. But for now, I'd like our focus to be how we can give this prompt to our students and have them use it when they're making AI inquiries to train themselves to ask better questions. Sometimes the questions that learners ask when they're using Google or AI platforms are awkward or clumsy because they don't yet have the nuance in their own expression to ask specifically what they want. One of the texts I taught last year was an Inspector Calls by Sheriff, which is an Edwardian play, and it has a somewhat confusing and interesting ending in that we never really get to understand who the inspector was and why he was calling. Could be that he is a police officer, but it could also be that he's some sort of supernatural or angelic presence. And Sheriff leaves that open-ended. It's supposed to raise more questions than answers. And one of my students asked, "What's it all about? What's the ending all about?" And I knew, of course, that what he really meant was, "I'm confused by the ending and would like some clarity." But if he were doing a Google search, he might literally phrase it like this: "What's the ending all about?" So let's feed that into the Cognitive Verifier prompt and see what happens. So here we are in ChatGPT 4, and I've fed the Cognitive Verifier prompt into the system. I've had verification from the large language model that it understands the prompt and is standing by for the first question that I'm going to ask of it. And I've typed in exactly what we've just said. What's the ending all about? And look what happens here. Look how the prompt encourages this kind of divergent inquiry.
To more accurately address your query about the ending of An Inspector Calls, I'd need to consider the following questions. Are you asking about the literal events that occur at the end of the play, or the thematic implications? Are you interested in how the ending affects specific characters, or the ensemble as a whole? Is your focus on the social commentary aspect of the ending? Are you curious about the audience's intended takeaway from the ending? Would you like to explore how the ending fits into the genre and style of the play? Do you want to know about the historical or cultural context that might influence the ending?
I think you can see that all of these are really nicely phrased questions, and they also pass out the ways in which that question can be interpreted. So the learner can look at their original question, look at the ways in which it could be interpreted, and then train themselves to refine the ways in which they're making their inquiries. They could also take any one of these and cut and paste it into a Google search, and they're more likely to get an outcome that serves their needs. But the prompt, of course, goes one step further, because it then takes all of the questions that it's raised and amalgamates them into offering an answer that it thinks might be a useful overview. And we won't be going in and looking at that response in any detail, because we're not here to learn about an inspector calls today, and I've got a lot more to share with you. But you can try this for yourself and see how it operates. Incidentally, I took exactly that same query about the ending of an inspector calls, and I ran it through a couple of the other chatbots that are available to see how they compared to one another. So let's take a look at what Google's Bard had to say. So here are some additional questions that might help me more accurately answer your question about the ending of an inspector call. So it is running the prompt. What are the main events of the play's climax? How do the characters react to the events of the climax? What are the themes of the play that are most relevant to the ending? What is the message that the playwright's trying to convey? And then it gives us some fairly cursory responses, followed by a summative comment that is 2 and a bit lines long. So the response from Google Bard is relevant. It does run the prompt, but the output is significantly underwhelming in comparison to what ChatGPT is currently able to produce. I found similar results with Anthropic's Claude 2. It did successfully run the prompt, and it does give us an answer. It does raise questions of the question. But if you look at the quality of the questions here, what happens in the final scene of the play? How do the characters react? Does the ending reveal that the inspector's a ghost or a supernatural being? Do the characters seem to have learned anything from the experience? Does the ending suggest the characters will change their behaviours going forward? It just doesn't have the same level of subtlety or the same kind of insight that I'm getting from ChatGPT 4. And finally, here's the answer I got from Pi, which is DeepMind's large language model. Although, to be fair to them, they present Pi as a conversational bot rather than something that's been set up to deal with these kind of inquiries. But nonetheless, we get the rather charming response. Interesting. I've never heard of a task like that before, but I'm happy to give it a try. It sounds like we'll be playing a sort of Q&A game. So here's my first question for you. Can you give me some more details about this An Inspector Calls thing? Is it a book, a movie, or a play? I love how casual and chatty the chatbot is here. So I respond, well, it's a play, and I want to know what the ending's all about. Sure, let's start by asking some more questions about the story to help make sense of the ending. Does the play follow a traditional structure, like the typical 3-act structure you see in a lot of stories? So Pi doesn't seem to have any understanding of the play at all, and so I didn't further the conversation at that point. So let's look at another example. I opened up a new chat, cut and pasted the cognitive verifier prompt in, and then I asked this question. What was the most important event of the 20th century? And the large language model again has run the prompt and...
To address your question comprehensively, here are some additional questions that can help narrow the focus. 1. Are we considering importance in terms of social, political, technological, or cultural impact? 2. Is the scope global, or are we focusing on a particular region or country? 3. Should the event be one that had immediate consequences, or are long-term effects also to be considered? 4. Are we looking for a singular event, or can it be a series of connected events? 5. How are we defining event? As something that took place over a short period, or could it span several years? Once I have your thoughts on these, I can provide a more tailored answer.
Now, this time you'll notice that the large language model didn't take that extra step and then combine its own questions to yield the answer, even though my prompt was exactly the same. And the more time I spend working with these chatbots, the more I realize that they will adhere to the prompt to some degree, but not absolutely reliably. It's not in the same way that you'd run a computer program that adheres strictly and absolutely to its parameters. And I don't think this is necessarily a problem, but it's something to be aware of and something to teach our learners so that if they run into situations like this, they know how to navigate it. In this case, I refined my question by saying, what's the most important global political event, an event that is limited to a 24-hour period? And with that refinement, we can see that ChatGPT has gone on to talk about the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima in 1945 and explains why it settled upon that event. And then I asked a follow-up question, which was, well, what would you then consider to be the most important global tech development in that century? And ChatGPT has then rerun the prompt criteria, so it's asking some questions about my question.
Determining the most important global tech development of the 20th century is subjective, but considering your interest in education and AI, here are some additional questions to narrow it down. Are we considering the importance in terms of widespread adoption or impact? Is the tech development more hardware or software oriented? Should the development be foundational, meaning it enabled other technologies to be built upon it? Are we taking into account how the technology impacted various sectors like education, healthcare, and economy? Given those questions, one contender could be the invention of the integrated circuit, IC, more commonly known as the microchip, in 1958.
If one way that students can shoot themselves in the foot when composing questions is to use vague or ambiguous language, another is to ask questions that are set up to provide a binary answer, yes or no, black and white thinking, when actually there's a whole bunch of nuance or shades of grey that could be mined into. To round things off today, let's go back into ChatGPT 4 and do a live demonstration where we explore the ways in which the cognitive verifier prompt can help candidates to reframe this kind of binary thinking. So here we are in GPT-4, we've got the default model selected, and I've typed the following prompt. So when you are asked a question about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Casey, follow these rules. Generate a number of additional questions that would help you more accurately answer the question. Combine the answers to the individual questions to produce the final answer to the overall question. Ask me for my first question. So let's enter. And we've got confirmation, and it's standing by for me to ask my first question. It's really important that we put that bit here, ask me for my first question. Otherwise, it will generate a question that it thinks you might be interested in. So here's a binary question. Is McMurphy an anti-hero? Which invites a response, either yes he is or no he isn't, when we know, in fact, if you've studied this book, there are some qualities of McMurphy's character that would suggest he is an anti-hero, but others that definitely don't conform to that stereotype. So let's see how the large language model manages this. The first thing that jumps right out to me is just look at the volume of the response we've got here. It's so much more thorough than the other large language models that I've been testing so far. I don't think OpenAI have any worries about competitors knocking on the door, at least at this stage. And just as we'd expect, the kind of questions that it asks of the question are fantastic.
What is the traditional definition of an anti-hero? What are McMurphy's motivations throughout the story? Does McMurphy exhibit traditionally heroic qualities? How does McMurphy's behaviour affect the other characters, particularly those in the mental institution? How do the novel's themes and setting influence the perception of McMurphy's character?
And then we have our sub-answers, and then it takes all of those sub-answers and produces a final answer for us, followed by some thought-provoking questions that we could follow up with if we wished. Given how successful my early forays into this prompt have been, I'm now in the process of sharing this with my classes and encouraging them to use it in their research and also in their revision for examination prep. If we want our learners to be autonomous and empowered individuals, then giving them tools like this, the ability to ask the right questions to get the right answers from these amazing technological tools they have at their fingertips, has to be a step in the right direction. So I hope some of this has been useful. If it has, please click the like button. Do think about subscribing, and until next time.